Greetings and salutations, friends and listeners. It's 11:16 a.m. on a Sunday morning. I kind of wanted to bing that 11:11, but I didn't. I just missed it. I got caught up in anticipatory thoughts and actions. But here we are, off to a lackadaisical Sunday brunch special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast. Hello and namaste. Greetings and salutations, friends and fellow travelers of the Cosmoverse. May what's that saying from that one movie? That one dystopian adventure we all love and think we're living through. May the odds be ever in your favor. Since it is Sunday, I thought I would return to a thing I haven't done in a while. And it happens. That this is what came up. And it's quite appropriate for a Sunday. Empty and Marvelous. Page 123. Oh wait, before that, actually I wanted to open with this before I played the opening credits. Quote from the back cover. Quote, "No one has given us such a concise, freshly written introduction to the whole history of the Far Eastern development of Buddhist thought as Alan Watts in the present highly readable book." Joseph Campbell. Like the Joseph Campbell wrote that for the back cover of this book. There are several other great reviews for that, but from 123. Quoting Matsu, I believe, if I'm reading this correctly. I just dropped into a page that I flapped open to, right? A sutra says, quote, "It is only a group of elements which come together to make this body," end quote. When it arises, comma, only these elements arise, period. When it arises, only these elements arise. Tavat, how does that one go? I always butcher this, and I always forget if I have it right in my head. Tavat Asam or Asahi, that's fish. What is that? Anyways, that thou art that which is, I think. But I digress. That was me interjecting. When it arises, only these elements arise. When it ceases, only these elements cease. But when these elements arise, do not say, quote, "I am arising." And when they cease, do not say, quote, "I am ceasing." End quote. So too with our former thoughts, latter thoughts, and intervening thoughts, and in parentheses, or experiences, and then colon like a formula, like equals the thoughts follow one another without being linked together. Each one is absolutely tranquil. And that's from Kutsun Hisu Yulu 124. That's the reference anyways, 10H. I'm sure we could look that up in the back of the book. As Maurice Richardson points out on the back cover of the book, Mr. Watts's book is certainly the most explicit and orderly account of Zen Buddhism that has yet appeared in English. Why do I share all that with you, friends, on this delightful Sunday morning, this August 9th, at 11:22? There we go, that's a pretty one. That's a little bit of delightful numbers. Because I share this at you, friends, because a long time ago, long before the internet existed the way it exists now, in some form of that same sort of memified question game of like, what would you do if, that we all have always played throughout time. Someone asked me, what was the question? Something about like, what would you take with you if you were surviving the end of the world? What would you take from the normal world, quote, normal world? And I think at some point someone explicitly asked me, like, what books would you save, right? So it was a series of questions like that led me down a deep contemplation, and I had to eventually, over time, I think, develop an answer. And this is one of them. The Way of Zen. I wish I could show you how this book looks, because it's beautiful, and I've never seen this same edition cover on any other of the bookshelf copies of this book. Go get this book if you've never read this book before in your life, and you are remotely interested in anything spiritual, even if it's just tarot. You like tarot? Go read this book. You like what's the astrology and palm reading? Go read this book. I shit you not. You like physics? Go read this book. In fact, the play I've written, although it wasn't overtly, it should have been. I forgot to put this scene in when we produced it, because it was like a rough draft production. But in the plays that I'm writing / books that I'm writing, there is a character that carries this book around, and there's a set of characters that carries the magical set of books around. I have a list of books that, like, if I survived the end of the world, I would carry that book. And if I was a millionaire at the moment where I was like, okay, I think the end of the world is right around the corner, and I was a millionaire, I would literally, I shit you not. That's why I'm going to write this into a book. Don't steal this from me, by the way. Just because I'm sharing this publicly on my podcast doesn't mean you can rip this off and put it in your own literature. This is stuff that's going into my book. You're getting a behind-the-scenes look at my slow, janky-ass inability to write my epic multi-book universe of characters that should make me a wealthy media empire mogul, akin to, Harry Potter, etc. But I lag at writing because, I sit there and stare at the screen and the words don't come out. But it's all stuck in my head, and I'm going crazy. But I digress. So I would aspire to literally be able to do this in real life. Not that I want the end of the world to happen anytime soon. I'm fairly certain it doesn't happen for at least another X many years. Maybe double, maybe triple X many years. But yeah, this is one of those books. For reals, I swear to you. And thus, I will write about it in such a way. And I hope that no one sues me. And to that end, since the show is now officially beginning...
Warning. This podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household. listen at your own risk to unauthorized and explicit reading. Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings.
If we watch the shore while we are sailing in a boat, we feel that the shore is moving. But if we look near to the boat itself, we know then that it is the boat which moves. When we regard the universe in confusion of body and mind, we often get the mistaken belief that our mind is constant. But if we actually practice Zen and come back to ourselves, we see that this was wrong. Dogen's Shobogenzo, as referenced on page 122, Principle and Practice of Empty and Marvelous, in the smack dab middle of Alan Watts's The Way of Zen. I've owned this book for a very long time, and against most book nerd cultural norms, I've abused this book, in as much as that I've deigned to highlight it like crazy, like it was a history book from school, which it wasn't, right? You know, I read this book first in a library, sort of just like lingering around in a really big library. I don't remember when. I don't remember the immediate context of which library, why I was there, but I remember being in a library as a young person and just like wandering the shelves and stumbling across this book in a much older, library hardbound edition. And it being just profoundly beautiful to peek into and be a part of with my brain, because books are worlds within worlds captured on paper. I then later immediately tracked a copy down at my favorite Barnes & Noble and or Borders and got it. And I've, too many page corners are bookmarked. And it's embarrassing. Book snob enthusiasts would be like, how dare you? There's this page over here. I just flipped to page 40. That's, there's writing in the margin. All four corners are tabbed. There's something important on each page on both sides. There's highlighting and there's pencil. There are two words that are circled here: non-dual and relativity. But I digress. Back on page 122, at the very top. Oh, by the way, you're supposed to all go get a copy, and as we read along and learn from it, right? I think that's the way this book club works. man's identification with with his idea of himself. So man's identification with his idea of himself gives him a specious and precarious sense of permanence. This is Mr. Watts speaking himself. The previous two things I read were quotes. This is Mr. Watts' own words, right? For this idea, this ideation, this ideologue of ourselves, this cartoon mask made up of word idea clusters. That's me interjecting. Forgive me. Right? I like to pause sometimes and just like spin my thoughts alongside what he said, because this is so formative. Anyways, let me start over. Take 3. Man's identification with his idea of himself gives him a specious and precarious sense of permanence. For this idea is relatively fixed, being based upon carefully selected memories of his and or hers, that's me inserting, past memories which have a preserved and fixed character. This next sentence is critical, right? Social convention encourages the fixity of the idea because the very usefulness of symbols depends upon their stability. So much we could discuss just in that. I think that what this chapter hits on, just these 2 pages, right? They face each other, 122 and 123. What these 2 pages help us when we read them, and if we just really deeply sink into individual statements made, right? When this body arises, these elements arise, and that's it. And this illusion of permanence and this notion of being able to perceive the impermanence if one adjusts one's perspective, as illuminated by the analogy of the boat sailing down the river, or up the river, or along the coastal shore, I guess would make the most sense. As Mr. Watts points out, the relativity of time and motion is one of the principal themes of Dogen's Shobogenzo. And that's where that quote dropped in. On page 123, he goes on to say, Buddhism has frequently compared the course of time to the apparent motion of a wave, wherein the actual water only moves up and down, creating the illusion of a piece of water moving along over the surface. It is a similar illusion that there is a constant, quote, self, end quote, moving through successive experiences, constituting a link between them in such a way that the youth becomes the man, who becomes the graybeard, who becomes the corpse. a wild and fascinating thing to assert that level of individuation. I think, right, that there's that the illusion is in such and such a way about our experience, about just being alive. Of course, one of the fascinating things that's going on right now as a sort of juxtaposition of comprehension here, this book was first the Way of Zen by Alan Watts. Oh, by the way, just for a fun footnote of reference, so should you be so curious that you might want to go and get more of these, I would not discourage anyone from doing so. I would say that I have not. Let me make a disclaimer. I have not read all of his other works in full, but I have, whenever I've come across any of them, tried to sample chapters, right, in the bookstore, like we all do, and I do own at least one, if not maybe two. Yes, two. I own two of his other titles. Okay, so of the two books, this is the most amazingly, like, this one that I'm reading to you from today is the most, like, profound, fecund, like, fertile, powerful, like, it works a magic on you, and it brings you into a realm of when you get lost in a great book. This happens here. This is not dry and boring and technical in any way, shape, or form. He's a brilliant, for his time, right? He's a brilliant storyteller. And it might feel a little dated. Like I was about to say, if I'm not mistaken, so the edition I'm holding is from 1989, but I think it might have originally been published in 1957 by Pantheon Books, New York. Don't sue me, anybody, for reading this book. I want more people to read it. And I believe, quite honestly, that one could couple this with, I would say Karen Armstrong's History of God. And it's a tough call, depending if you want to limit it to just 3 or open it up to a few more. But if I was a nerd that was surviving the end of the world and shoving important things into a special bag or box or whatever, thing for safety and transport, that I was gonna be like, this is important, and would be, like I said, if I was a Batman level billionaire, I would have bought enough to be like, this is so important, you should have some survivors of the end of the world, and I would have, made sure they were secure and safe to be able to retrieve them after surviving the apocalypse. Like, if I was a Batman level billionaire, which is sort of supposed to be the goal in terms of, that's the story that I'm writing, like, right? Like, the writer is a tore-up has-been of a creative that suddenly strikes it rich and goes off on a crazy rich person's agenda, and that's sort of the long arc. But I digress. There are literally books I would be like, these books are so important that they should be sort of instead of the Bible, these should be, no offense to the Bible. I would keep the Bible and be like, we should know it and it should be saved too, but not that I would destroy the Bible, right? I don't want to hurt the Bible. But it shouldn't be the Bible anymore. It should be the central pillar around which we build our society, because we don't really understand it and there's too much arguing about it. And we should start with books that work magic on us and heal us and lead us down a virtuous path of really understanding each other in a meaningful way now, as people who are facing our own self-created postmodern pseudo-apocalypse, right? And choose my words carefully. As to return to the book really briefly, to share with you another nugget of brilliant Zen-like stuff that you should just let fester in your mind. Quote, Zen begins at the point where there is nothing further to seek, nothing to be gained. Zen is most emphatically not to be regarded as a system of self-improvement or a way of becoming a Buddha. Bum, bum, bum. Self-contradiction. What? In the words of Lin Chi, if a man seeks the Buddhahood, that means that man loses the Buddhahood. Or as a Zenrin poem puts it, quoting a Zenrin poem, in the landscape of spring, there is neither high nor low. The flowering branches grow naturally, some long, some short. Contemplate that a minute. Why don't you? One must not forget the social context of Zen. It is primarily a way of liberation for those who have mastered the disciplines of social convention, of the conditioning of the individual by the group. Mastered. Not been oppressed by, not been enslaved to. Mastered. There is this... One of the things I love about this book and why I advocate for it and why I flirt with getting in trouble with the very publishers by reading about it and telling you things about it a lot is because I think everyone needs to read it more than other books, even though plenty of other books are awesome and should be enjoyed and whatnot. And I swear to you, hand on the very book itself and the Bible, that no one's paying me or asking me to do this. Like, I'm doing this because I am obsessed with this book. It goes on from the thing. This is Alan Watts' own words here. Let me reread that real quick. One must not forget the social context of Zen. It is primarily a way of liberation for those who have mastered the disciplines of social convention, of the conditioning of the individual by the group. Zen is a medicine for all the ill effects of this conditioning, for the mental paralysis and anxiety which can come from excessive self-consciousness. It must be seen against the background of societies regulated by the principles of Confucianism, as with their heavy stress on propriety and punctilious ritual. Social conditioning fosters the identification of the mind with a fixed idea of self as the means of self-control and or tyrannical control, may I interject, as when it is abused and misused by a system that understands some of this more nuanced comprehension of how the human experience phenomena works. The next page, he's going on about this dilemma of controlling self-control. Where does that begin? And it's something I think he addresses very early on in the book too. So it's a big sort of meta reference. This notion that we are in control in any way, shape, or form. Western society is fundamentally built on it. Who's number one? You're number one. What are you in control of? Yourself and your life and your destiny and your freedom and your free will and ta-da-ta-da-ta-da. But these fundamental projections, let's not dismiss them, right? I mean, they are assumptions that our entire society is based on, are not the healthiest ways to model those behaviorized, thinky constructs. If I can make up a term, please and thank you. This is me. This is not Alan Watts. Just to be clear, in case anyone gets lost and thinks that I'm still reading from Alan Watts, but it's me ad-libbing. No, I apologize. I'm coming back to this thing. We live in a world that's so great and yet so not great that we, no matter who we are, all kind of want to escape it. And we also live in a world enshrined in a grand mystery, right? As all the memes point out, like, is this live, work, eat, poop, shower, sleep cycle, is that it? The fundamentals of quote-unquote life, pay your taxes, choose your vices, and die, that's it? Is that all that's supposed to happen? Are we just supposed to contribute to the progress of the ongoing carrying forward of the institutions we've created? Is that's where the value at? Like, what's going on? And I would argue that it's worth exploring all the ideas that rattle the cages of our fundamental conscious and unconsciously assumed and projected presumptions about the world and how it works. And about life itself. Like, how does this thing we call life actually function? And is our presumed, assumed, and sort of thoughtlessly carried around baggage about it like the best choice, the best baggage, the most accurate? Or is it not? So Zen can sound really dark and meaningless, except that especially if you're not really keen on what its sort of like solution is. Its solution is to sort of remind the being, whoever the being is, you, me, anybody else, that there's a modality we can... What's the right word here? A modality we can engage in, be caught up in, that is one that is the most efficient and most in alignment, in good alignment with the overarching emphasis being, manifest by the beings other than us. And I don't mean to displace responsibility, because they're all ourselves, right? But the higher order, as opposed to, in juxtaposition to, our lowest order self, the ego mind. As I highlighted here on page 144, as soon as I recognize that my voluntary and purposeful action happens spontaneously, quote, by itself, end quote, just like breathing, hearing, and feeling, I am no longer caught in the contradiction of trying to be spontaneous. There is no real contradiction, since trying is spontaneity. Seeing this, the compulsive, blocked up, and tied up feeling vanishes. It is just as if I had been absorbed into a tug of war between my two hands and had forgotten that both were mine. No block to spontaneity remains when the trying is seen to be needless. Here then, skipping ahead a little bit, here then is the point of the oft-repeated assertion that, quote, all beings are in nirvana from the very beginning. Quote, that, quote, all dualism is falsely imagined. Quote, the ordinary mind is the Tao mind. There is therefore no meaning in trying to get into accord with it. In the words of the Cheng Tao Ke, like the empty sky, it has no boundaries, yet it is right in this place, ever profound and clear, When you seek to know it, you cannot see it. You cannot take hold of it, but you cannot lose it. In not being able to get it, you get it. When you are silent, it speaks. When you speak, it is silent. The great gate is wide open to bestow alms, and no crowd is blocking the way. Paradoxically, nothing is more artificial than the notion of artificiality. Try as anyone may, it is as impossible to go against the spontaneous Tao as to live in some way other as it is as impossible to go against the spontaneous Tao as to live in some other time than now, or some other place than here. When a monk asked Bankei what he thought of disciplining oneself to attain Satori, the master said, quote, Satori stands in contrast to confusion, since each person is the substance of the Buddha, in reality, there is not one point of confusion. What, then, is one going to achieve by Satori? What does that even mean? It almost to a cynical mind, as I myself have encountered, it almost feels like a dismissal of, a self-contradicting as he explains on page 146, from the Buddhist point of view, reality itself has no meaning, since it is not a sign pointing to something beyond itself. To arrive at reality, and this is what is meant by spontaneity, right? I think one of the things that we do as people, we've conditioned ourselves to do over the multiple generations of being alive in all these different bodies, handing down this constant evolving set of psychologically manipulative conditioning, is that we've conditioned ourselves to minimize and neglect some of the most powerful things in the universe that are real, like love. Sounds hokey and cheesy and fake, but think about what that means. We've tricked ourselves into neglecting, minimizing, and almost rejecting, arguing against, disbelieving in love as a power in the universe, etc. Zen lies beyond the ethical standpoint, whose sanctions must be found not in reality itself, but in the mutual agreements of human beings. What does that mean? When we attempt to universalize or absolutize it, the ethical standpoint makes it impossible to exist, for we cannot live for a day without destroying the life of some other creature. Oof. If Zen is regarded as having the same function as religion in the West, we shall naturally want to find some logical connection between its central experience and the improvement of human relations. But this is actually putting the cart before the horse. The point is rather that some such experience or way of life as this is the object of improved human relations. In the culture of the Far East, the problems of the human relations are the sphere of Confucianism rather than Zen. But since the Shang Dynasty, 959 to 1278, it's a nice long dynasty, Zen has consistently fostered Confucianism and was the main source of the introduction of its principles to Japan. It saw their importance for creating the type of cultural matrix in which Zen could flourish without coming into conflict with social order, because the Confucian ethic is admittedly human and relative, not divine and absolute. What does all that mean? The natural, we hear this term get used, and this is me speaking, right? We hear this term get used a lot throughout culture, throughout time, in art, and in the words of public discourse, and sometimes even in the words of legal structures and whatnot. The natural order of things. And one really has to question that and ponder, where does one draw the line as to what the natural order of things actually is? And I think what Alan Watts does so brilliantly in such a evocatively, like, almost visual way is remind us that, like, nature is the very reality of sitting in the deepest silence on a rainy knoll in the forest, deeply absorbed in the now, which to some people sounds tedious or like a bad night of camping, right? But Zen points to that in as much as that in such places or conditions where we can give into the liminality, we can relate to the functioning of what is going on within us, through us, around us, and how we relate to one another in a way that is informed. Perhaps, dare I use the term, my own crazy mantra, healed. Let's say it all together, healed. If we can heal ourselves, I'm adding, right? Like what Alan Watts brings in to our understanding through this book is an aha moment, or several really. And one of the aha moments being highlighted today with the sort of random flipping through roulette style sort of bibliomancy, dare I use that term. I almost put that in the cover page for the episode, but then I worry that it might scare people off. Bibliomancy is like cartomancy, which is what tarot is, right? Like using imagery, or in this case words, as a mirror to reflect upon one's own thought processes or needs or questions or concerns about the world. This reality is very real. One of the things I didn't read that was somewhere in, like, literally in my vision was, I believe, a quote of a poem, and it was on one of the pages that I was flipping to. And now, of course, my hands have not been keeping tabs. But it was basically like, it reminded me of something I've read off before in the show. That's like, it's a common wisdom, ancient teaching. Before enlightenment, you've got to chop wood and carry water. Right? What does that mean? The fundamentals of maintaining your day-to-day livelihood. Like, if you've chopped wood and carried water, then you can cook and clean. Truth. Basic, pre-convenience mode living reality. That if you've done that work, chopping of the wood and carrying of the water, then then in your house you can cook and clean things that need to be cooked and cleaned. And that's what the primary objective of most any day of a humble, seeker of truth out in the woods, doing the practices of discovering the inner wisdoms, etc., etc. And so the saying goes, before enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. This other one was the one that I saw that I did not read. Was a little bit more explicit. Oh, here it is. We eat. This is a Doka poem by Ikkyu. Ikkyu, if you want to look that name up. Quote, we eat, excrete, sleep, and get up. This is our world. All we have to do after that is to die. So Buddhism is, that sounds pretty dark, but also it relates to the simplicity of what wisdom, what this teaching brings to a comprehension. That, because all of this is compared to nature. Like, what does, there was this other portion, this other section that I also didn't read, that I meant to, that I had tagged with a finger so that is this it here? No, that's the Wheel of Becoming, which I do want to maybe poke at, but in that other thing, and I probably should stop because I'm flirting with disaster. Well, here's a really deep one, which is not the thing I was going to read. The other thing I was going to read was about the fish. Oh, is this it? No. There, I found the fish. This other one is great too. Hold on, now I've fumbled the other page. Okay, but hold on. Before I spiral out of control, and it's been a long-ass read. It's 12:12. Ding. We live this life, and we have constructed this madness. And it might just be that there are other things we need to be focusing on that are less toxic and less insane than the way we run politics, the way we enforce our legislation, the way we build our infrastructure, the way we have created a convenience-based cultural system of profiteering on each other, etc., right? All of it. Because if we want to change some of it, and it's all one big interconnected thing that we create, from economics and financing and all the corruption that springs from that, to legislation and justice and justice reform and all these places that we fight for things. We could be, in theory, being called to do a whole bunch of other stuff. And that perhaps, just maybe, that's why we created systems to remind ourselves of how to connect to the inner divinity, right? It must be remembered that in Taoist and Buddhist thought, there is no conception of God who is deliberately and consciously governs the universe. Lao Tzu said of the Tao, which is the overriding force of all things, the consciousness of consciousnesses, the life force that manifests everything, etc., etc. Quote, to its accomplishments it lays no claim. It loves and nourishes, sorry, that was me butchering the pronunciation of a simple word. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. The Tao, without doing anything, Wu Wei, leaves nothing undone. Every action, every event comes of itself from the void. Right? And the void is that which is simultaneously giving birth to it all, and in receiving it all, taking it all in, arguably. This bit about the fish is long, and maybe I'll save it for later, but... Well, I'll read you just the first bit as an example, because it contains itself, actually, is really great. The very first sentence contains the meaning and metaphor of the entire teaching. When a fish swims, he swims on, and there is no end to the water.